If y'all know me, you know I love hot takes, which is why I asked web dev Twitter to give me their spiciest takes about the state of web dev. I thought this tweet would do okay, but I did not expect it to be seen over 4 million times and to get almost 1,000 hot takes as replies to it. Let's go through those hot takes and take a look at some of my favorites, my least favorites, and generally what's going on in the web dev world. This is my tweet, but we're not here for my tweet. We're here for the things people replied. So we're going to go through the biggest, but that does not necessarily mean these are the best ones. This is one of the first ones that I really had to think about. If you don't know DKP already, he's the creator of XState, which is one of the most thorough state management libraries in React. It works with other frameworks too, and it's really focused on like diagramming things out so you have a proper flow chart for your state machines. As such, he cares a lot about state, especially global state and how it relates to your application, which is why his take here makes sense. UI components are the wrong place to put your app logic most of the time. Sure, it's easy and convenient at first, but in the long run, baking logic into UI makes it really difficult to understand what's going on in your app, much less maintain it. I largely agree with this tweet, but I think it's missing one of the important nuances, which is most of the time, especially if your application gets really big, you don't need to know how everything works. I don't know how every piece of even ping works, and I built a lot of those complex pieces. When I need to, I can figure it out. And sure, that takes a little bit more time than it would if everything was done with a good global state manager like XState. However, the amount of work it takes to implement any given new feature, as well as maintain a small piece that I might already understand, is much higher when everything is within the global state. So in the context of knowing how your whole application works, absolutely, David's correct here. But in the context of what makes me more effective as a developer contributing to a growing code base to solve the problems that my users have, this isn't necessarily true. It depends a lot more. Overall, good take, but it's important to think a lot about when global does and doesn't make sense for you, your application, your team, and your users. I think I said largely this here. The clarity and compartmentalization of component level logic is hard to beat if you use it responsibly. It's really nice. Obviously, things that should be global should be global. Like if you have 15 of those like context providers wrapping your app, we need to rethink some things, but it's not that common a use case. I think there's an opportunity here. This one's fun. Tailwind wouldn't be nearly as popular if React made it easy to author styled scopes to your component. I understand where this is coming from. The problem is if you're building an application with React and you want to have some styles that are specific to your component that are only there when your component's imported, that aren't there when your component isn't imported, it can get a little messy. I see people mentioning CSS modules in the chat. Yeah, that helps some amount. But when you look at something like Astro or Vue, where the style is part of the component architecture, that is fundamentally different. That said, I still use Tailwind when I use those technologies. I couldn't imagine using even Astro without Tailwind, not because it doesn't have ways to solve those problems myself, but because Tailwind isn't just a way to style within a component, it's a way to write styles more effectively. It makes me enjoy CSS in a way I never have before. It's so much quicker to make a change and not have to worry about the relationship that change has in your entire system. And I know we get the inline styles joke a lot, where like Tailwind is just OP versions of inline styles. And I like that. I think inline styles get more shit than they deserve. And the benefit of something like Tailwind is how much easier and more efficient it makes it to write a high quality style system for your components that just happens to live within the component's HTML. It's effectively the pieces for a design system built through utility classes. And I like that a lot. I think Tailwind caught on better because React needed a solution to this problem, which is why we saw so many different solutions come up in the React ecosystem, from stitches to styled components to all the weird libraries like Material UI. We needed a better way to compartmentalize and componentize our styles in React. And Tailwind has won because it's the best solution for componentizing your styles. However, Tailwind still was the best solution without React. And I still think Tailwind would have found a decent bit of success otherwise. Although, yes, I agree, React absolutely catapulted the success of Tailwind. And someone else has made a good point of, even if you currently consider Tailwind unreadable, the fact that it's the same between projects is a really underrated benefit, which it absolutely is. Not having to relearn our style system or like make a library that's shared across things. We just copy and paste our Tailwind config and everything works the exact same way. It's really nice. It's kind of like a prettier moment in that way, where this thing that used to take a lot of your brain suddenly doesn't. And I like that a lot. Here's a good one from Devin. If you don't already know Devin, he works at Adobe. He works on React Aria, which is a library for doing good accessibility for your components. It's one of those like headless component libraries, kind of like Radix. And his point here is very good. Despite a huge portion of web traffic being mobile and tablet, and a lot of laptops even having touch screens, we're not thinking about the touch experience when we build stuff. A simple example of this is how often we use hover behaviors. There's no such thing as hover on a mobile device. You can't hover with touch. I mean, yeah, you can put your finger like slightly over the screen, but it doesn't do anything. Most devices don't have a way to detect that as an input. And a lot of us love to have things like if I type, you'll see this gets darker when I hover over it. And this has the tooltip of what it is when I hover over it. None of those behaviors work on mobile. And that's a really important thing to understand when you're building your applications, especially web applications that mobile and tablet users will use, is that a lot of the behaviors that you work on aren't going to work if they're expecting a mouse. So being more considerate of this as you build is very important. He also links a blog here about building good buttons with accessible behaviors, and one literally just dedicated to hover interactions. So if you want to learn more about this, definitely check out the tweet. But man, we need to be better to touch users as they begin to take up a higher and higher percentage of our traffic. Otherwise, they're going to despise web and web devs because we're not providing good enough experience for them. So I really liked this take, and it's something I need to myself do more of. I love this. And DKP came back for another spicy take because he didn't think his original one was spicy enough. And by the numbers here, looks like he was right. An enormous amount of capital, talent, and effort is being spent on making web dev apps just a little faster. Performance is important, but we're pretty far into the diminishing returns curve at this point. I totally agree. I feel like the conversations we're having about performance on Twitter are less about when you have a big application, how do we make sure it continues to run well? Rather, they feel like they're more about how few kilobytes can we ship in our hello world. And that doesn't benefit anybody. Obviously, when something like Wasm has a multi-megabyte hello world, that's a problem we need to solve. But when we go to a more sane place like React or the other new libraries forming around it, the difference between an 80 kilobyte JavaScript bundle and a 20 kilobyte JavaScript bundle isn't that significant because any application is going to be writing more than 100 kilobytes of JavaScript of its own. So if you're bickering over those small differences, you've kind of missed the plot. I think we wasted too much time talking about performance. In fact, I even have a video planned about why we need to end the performance wars for this particular reason. While yes, we don't see devices getting better every year the way we used to, we also don't see code getting slower at the same rate either. And I think we have a good opportunity now to take a step back and appreciate where we are without continuing to rehash the performance wars. Here's a fun one from Parasocial. Next.js is not that great. Yes and no. I'd say that Next was incredible when it dropped, simply for pushing the idea that web devs need to care more about servers. So many React devs had gone so deep into single page app land that if they didn't have a GraphQL API, they didn't use the thing. When front-end devs stopped thinking about backend, front-end devs started doing really stupid things with backend. And one of the things Next did that hadn't been done before was really challenge front-end devs to think a lot about their backend and the relationship it had with their front end. I wouldn't have gone back to back end as hard as I did if it wasn't for Next.js, and I owe it a ton for that. On top of that, App Router is one of the best developer experiences I've ever had. Having that deep, close relationship between the back end and the front end has made it so much more fun to build and create incredible things. And I don't think we would have built either Marker Thing or Upload Thing anywhere near as quickly as if it wasn't for the benefits that Next.js offered through the App Router and server components. That all said, Next is just a framework around React, which is just a library, and it's not the only solution. And I think that I'm even guilty of this some amount. Treating Next like the only realistic solution is downplaying how much good work is being done in other places. So in the sense that there are other solutions that are comparably great in terms of their feature set and developer experience, I can agree. There are other tools that are in a really good place, and if we treat Next like the only one, that's a problem. However, Next is very unique in that it has this quality of experience while also being very well adopted and supported by many, many companies and many, many developers. Like, let's say theoretically, SvelteKit was perfect and it was a 10 out of 10 framework, and Next.js was an 8 out of 10 framework. While that does mean SvelteKit is greater than Next, Next is still, I would argue, a better bet simply because of how much better adopted it is. And that's what's cool, is by Next.js supporting these things, it allows for more developers to have a good enough, almost great, if not great experience. And he said not that great, so we'll say it is great. There are parts that are great, and bringing those to most developers is incredible. And with tools like SvelteKit, like Remix, and all these other frameworks, finding what greatness looks like in modern times, it's awesome we have frameworks like Next to bring that to the everyday dev. And then we have frameworks like Angular to 10 years later bring that to the IBM devs. It's really cool that we have this cycle of influence and creativity trickling its way through the ecosystem so that everybody has a better experience. So in that sense, I agree. There are greater things, but Next is still so important for the ecosystem. I like this one a lot. Jack Harrington dropped two takes that I fully agree with. I wouldn't say you should never ever roll your own auth, but you should be very cautious when you do it. And display grid is absolutely overrated. I've had very few problems that grid actually made easier. It's taken a lot of things and made them harder than they should be. And I've never actually had grid code I wrote work as expected the first try. That's not because grid is bad. It's because grid is a little bit obtuse and requires more effort to get just right. It's a very specific API. I'm going to hold the auth thing for a little bit because we have more auth takes coming up soon. Oh, Dax. He couldn't help himself. This one went way too viral, and he had an alternative to it that I'm going to have to scroll for. The reason the JS ecosystem is janky has nothing to do with tech. It's a lack of talent. JS historically attracted mediocre engineers. Good engineers are finally showing up to the JS world and fix it, but previous generations of leadership couldn't even get a package manager right. This is the part I disagree with. And I replied, pre-NPM, there were no package managers for programming languages that had a better experience than NPM did, period. On top of that, NuGet sucks. Pacman is not a developer thing. It's for managing things in like Arch's ecosystem. And Nix is a mess. It's a beautiful mess. It does a lot of cool things, but none of these were great tools for developers building applications, and none of them provided a good experience for building an open source application with dependencies. When Pete Hunt and I fully agree, you know you're fucking up a bit. And I fully agree with this. It's NPM changed everything, and it's important to understand that just because other things are better now does not mean NPM wasn't revolutionary at the time, and they're still continuing to improve it meaningfully. Obviously, there are now package management solutions like Crate.io and whatever that are in really good state in other ecosystems, but it took NPM to get us there. And we've learned a ton from what NPM has tried, tested, learned, and failed from. As for the rest, I have an alternative framing of this, which is rather than JS attracted mediocre engineers, JS and the tools around it lowered the bar for how good an engineer you had to be to ship something that worked to users. And in doing that, we have enabled a much larger number of developers to make applications that work. And if you want there to be fewer applications, if you want there to be fewer experiences that users can benefit from in the world, one of the best things you can do is kill JavaScript. Just destroy it, make it go away. But if you want there to be more applications that serve users' needs better, they might load slower, they might have weird dependency issues, they might be harder to work in after years of working on them. The fact that we can make them in the first place, and the fact that so many developers can build incredible things regardless of how much experience they have, it's actually one of the strengths of JavaScript. It's also one of the things that I think React gets a lot of shit for, because so many developers can and will continue building things in React that the average developer who picks Rust likes Rust and is an enthusiast that's really into programming languages and is probably better than your average engineer. The average developer working in JavaScript, probably below average, simply because there are so many JavaScript devs, the majority didn't even pick the language. They're just there working on it at their job. And as such, the average quality of dev is going to be lower because the reason that they're using it is fundamentally different and the number of users is exponentially larger. So while, sure, the massive number of engineers that aren't as experienced being part of the JavaScript ecosystem means that some tools are created that are lackluster, it also means infinitely more things are being built. And I think it's important to not downplay that part. This one got nowhere near as many likes because people love when you shit on JavaScript, but they don't like when you point out the truth. As Dax said here, I wouldn't trust the majority of people who repeat the cliche, JS sucks, with any language. There's nothing about it that's critically broken. It's missing things that are table stakes, but they're fixing it, and it has a bunch of stuff you can't get elsewhere. Absolutely agree. There's a reason JavaScript will continue winning, and it's not because it's taken over the world because it's bad. It's because there's a lot of things only JavaScript does, and JavaScript isn't the best language, but it's more than a good enough language. And what we've created with it as an ecosystem is truly special. And while it's fun to shit on, it's also incredible what we've done with it. And we should acknowledge that it will be here for a very, very, very long time. Now I got a fun one from Rox. 99% of software is trivial. Building most things is not hard. Getting people to care and pay for what you make is hard. I think there's difficulty in weird places for a lot of things. And up until recently, making something that scales was really hard. But building overall has gotten significantly easier. And the future I see isn't one where there's a small number of 100,000 person companies. It's a large number of 5 to 10 person companies that are building the perfect solution for their user base, which is smaller than Amazon's, but it's big enough to pay those people salaries. And I think as building things gets easier, the people who are building get better at promoting and showing the thing they built, as well as users become more familiar with the pattern of using a large number of small team tools rather than a small number of big team tools. We're going to see more and more market shift around this. But overall, yeah, building things isn't as hard as a lot seem to think. One point I think about a lot, when I brought up that I wrote a mobile app at Twitch in a few days to try and show what it would look like for us to use React Native, I got a surprising number of replies that were along the lines of, do you still have the code? You should sell it to Kik. That code must be so good and useful still. I wrote it in 3 days. I can write better code now. It was 4 years ago. The code is not why that was valuable. It was what it demonstrated to the company, which is in this short a window, we can make something incredible. Code is cheap. Most code can and should be thrown away at some point. It's the experience users have. And if we can do things to make that experience better, we need to be willing to throw away the thing we had before. Because building things is not the hard part. Understanding users and what they need is. And if your tools are making it harder for you to do that and do that effectively, your tools are bad. Very much agree with this one. Most web apps should not use an auth service. Yes and no. I understand. This is a direct contrast to what Harrington said earlier of never roll your own auth. There's a spectrum here for sure, where on like one side you have a self-rolled authentication library with your own email server and everything. On the other side, you have an auth service, and then in the middle you have open source libraries. But those libraries aren't doing a great job of keeping up. I don't want to call out NextAuth because I know Ballast and the crew are working incredibly hard on it. But Ballast also works at Vercel and is working incredibly hard on Next.js itself. NextAuth still doesn't support App Router well. It doesn't. They're working on it. It will get there. But right now, to have the best experience using the new tools, Clerk is pretty much the only option. I'm hyped on what's happening with Lucia auth. I'm hyped on seeing the open source ecosystem take these challenges more seriously, but I have lost so much time and energy to fixing weird auth edge cases that I am thankful to not be thinking about it anymore. There are so many one-off things that I didn't realize I was doing wrong until suddenly I had a service doing them right. And there is so much stress that I have had building good application authentication practice without using a service. One silly example. We put off building a mobile app for so long because the authentication solutions we were using around NextAuth did not even have a viable path for mobile. Getting something working decently that let you share an OAuth account between our web app and our mobile app was so impossible that we just never shipped the mobile app. With something like Clerk, it's exponentially easier to do that. And there are so many of those types of problems where whole platforms are harder to support than they should be because the authentication solution you built doesn't have a path there. And while yes, I could go work really hard on building a good mobile auth solution for us and for our use case, I'd be spending days, if not weeks, working on that when we could just be shipping to our users. And that's why I'm now very much auth service pilled. Funny enough, I used to get in fights with the CEO of Clerk about why it seemed so silly to me to build yet another auth company when there are open source libraries that do it just fine. He kind of snickered and was like, yeah, sure, we'll see. And slowly I came around and here I am now, huge Clerk shill, not because they paid me to, but quite the opposite, because I ask them to pay me. I flip hard on this. No offense to Kent. I just don't see this take from anybody who's building real software right now. Like if you're building big scalable applications that need to support more than one platform, you're probably going to run a third-party service at this point. There are so many things to consider when you make these decisions. It's hard to justify not using an auth service right now. I would struggle starting a new application without one simply because of how uneasy I would be as soon as I run into a problem that isn't supported. If we had better libraries and they were further along, this would be a different conversation. But it turns out it takes a lot of engineers, a lot of effort to make a good authentication solution with JWTs handled, with edge runtimes handled, with mobile handled, all these things. That's not something you can do rolling yourself unless it's your job full time with 3 other engineers. And having a company that does that well and charges me like $50 a month for it, that's pretty good. Auth is hard. If you think auth is easy, then your auth is bad. This is actually a really interesting one because I think it skirts around the conversation I see a lot, which is don't use a framework when you get started. Use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You got to learn the basics. My problem with the learn the basics argument is you don't know when you're done learning them. I could literally spend the next year just obsessively studying CSS and everything about it and still not have learned all of CSS. There is so much to any of those 3 parts at the beginning with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I don't like that we recommend people spend a ton of time in that without giving them clear boundaries for when that needs to change. When have you learned enough with HTML to move on to the next step? Really hard to know when you hit that threshold as a new developer. And that's why I usually recommend not starting by learning a specific thing so you don't know when you're done learning. Rather, start by building a specific thing because then you know if it's working or not. If you're not a developer yet, your intuition of enough isn't good. But you are a user. We all use things on the web. We all use applications. If you have a usable application as the bar you've set, it becomes much easier to know if your thing is good enough or not. And as you're learning to create things as a software dev, making sure you know exactly enough JavaScript is stressful. Making sure you know how to build an application is fun. And that's why I do like recommendations like learning Svelte or React early, because they help you build an application that you can understand faster. And yes, it doesn't make you as deep in the fundamentals of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, but you can learn those fundamentals when you need to. And ideally, you're not worrying about those things until you have a good footing in software dev. Once you're confident you can build a thing, the things you're less confident in, you can go address. And I do actually think Svelte's a good option here because Svelte kind of shows you the HTML, CSS, and JS. Yes, they're all in a file with a weird syntax and has its own rules and shit. But I do actually think Svelte is a powerful learning tool in this way. And I would absolutely not be opposed to somebody starting with Svelte as one of the places they go to build their first applications. And if they have a friend who's really into Svelte that can help them throughout, it's absolutely a good call. I still lean React, even though it's probably a harder learning curve and won't teach you as much of the fundamentals, simply because it's what the industry uses. And there's so many good resources that you can build something incredible quickly. But I absolutely agree with the sentiment here. I think Svelte's a really good recommendation for beginners. And I am tired of the you have to learn the basics before you start learning frameworks take, because it misses what makes development great, which is building things for users. Also, just before I forget to mention, Lee agreed with this take, which says a lot, as the next guy. The DOM should be replaced with WebGL. No, Flutter is a mistake, and this would be a mistake too. I'm happy this one came up because I was talking about this a bit earlier, and I really don't agree. The take is that 90% of the web development industry could disappear and the average quality of life would go up, not down. I do not agree at all. The benefit of the web development industry's growth is not that big companies are making things that are significantly more complex, although that has happened, and we love to point at that and complain that all these things are using React when they could just be HTML. The benefit of the way the web dev ecosystem has grown is that it allows for smaller teams to build bigger things. Yes, a 5-person team building a Twitter clone is going to be a bit more jank than a 100-person team that's been building it over 5 years. But the fact that a 5-person team can build a solution to the problem that they perceive and that their users have means that we can build better solutions for people much more effectively. And I think the same way we moved from 15 famous people to 15 minutes of fame to famous to 15 people, we're moving from 15 companies to companies being famous for 15 minutes or a few years to companies that have 15 to 500 users, because we can build more specialized quality solutions for people because it's easier to build them. And yes, the industry's gotten much bigger as a result, but the quality of life I have is much better because there are specialized tools like what I talked about earlier. Because I built it, I needed a way to chop my streams faster. And I built Marker Thing on top of the Twitch API and Clerk and the new Next App Router stuff to make it trivial for me to go to a stream, rip the timestamps from it, export these as a CSV. You can't see the button because of how my screen layout is, but I have a download CSV button right here. And once you download that CSV, I can drop it into another open source app called Lossless Cut. And Lossless Cut is an open source Electron-based video editor. This whole thing is written in JavaScript and it makes FFmpeg calls. And I'm able to use the CSV from my web app, a giant like 200 gig video file, and a bunch of JavaScript on both sides, and do something I couldn't do before. If it wasn't for these tools, I would not be able to make the amount of videos I make, and my team wouldn't be as efficient as they are. We would be worse off if 90% of the industry disappeared, because these types of quality specialized solutions go from the norm to not existing. And while you think 90% of the industry means 75% of the meta team working on React, what it actually means is the people building these specialized solutions that allow for people with niche problems to live better lives. So no, you're wrong. The average person has some amount of niche interest, and all of those niche interests are exponentially better served by the current state of the web dev industry. It is incredible where we've come, and I would never, ever go back to the way things were, knowing how many more quality applications I have that solve my specific problems. I think this is a good ending point. I appreciate each and every one of you for dropping your spicy takes. I hope that you enjoyed us going over them. If you want to learn more about how much web dev has improved, or I guess gotten worse over the last few years, we'll pin a video here all about that. Thank you guys as always. Appreciate you a ton. Peace, nerds.